May 1943. A train rolled slowly through the American countryside. Inside the cars were hundreds of German soldiers. Only weeks earlier, many of them had been fighting for their lives in North Africa. Now they were prisoners. They had been captured by the Americans and transported thousands of miles from the battlefield. But something was bothering them. The country outside the windows did not look like a nation at war. There were no bombed-out cities, no columns of refugees, no destroyed factories, no artillery craters, no starving civilians wandering through ruined streets. Instead, they saw farms, roads, automobiles, telephone poles, factories, railroads, and everywhere they looked, there seemed to be movement. America was working. America was producing. And for some of these German soldiers, that first glimpse of the United States created a realization far more unsettling than anything they had experienced on the battlefield. They had been told they were fighting a divided country, a nation of soft civilians separated from the realities of war, a country that would eventually become exhausted. But through the train window, they were seeing something else. They were seeing a country with an enormous industrial machine operating behind the front lines. And they had no idea yet how enormous it really was. The German prisoners arriving in America were part of one of the strangest logistical operations of the Second World War. The United States had never expected to become home to hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers. But after the Allied campaign in North Africa, the number of German prisoners began increasing dramatically. Britain was already struggling with the number of POWs it had to accommodate. America had space. It had enormous territory. And it had an increasingly urgent need for agricultural labor. So the United States began transporting prisoners across the Atlantic. The first major groups arrived in late 1942 and 1943. Then the numbers exploded. More and more German soldiers were captured in North Africa. Then came Sicily, Italy, Normandy, France, and eventually the collapse of Germany itself. By the end of the war, hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners had passed through the American POW system. For many of these men, the journey itself was the beginning of the psychological shock. They had spent years hearing about America, but hearing about a country was one thing. Seeing it was another. The German soldiers were accustomed to wartime Europe, cities under blackout, air raid sirens, destroyed buildings, food shortages, transportation disrupted by bombing, factories operating under constant threat. In Germany, civilians were living with the war directly outside their doors. America was different. The country was thousands of miles from the European battlefield. Its factories were producing weapons at an extraordinary rate, but its cities were largely untouched by the destruction. That contrast was difficult for a German prisoner to comprehend. Some prisoners arrived in American ports such as New York, Boston, or Norfolk. And then came one of the strangest sights of all. The American city. At night. Illuminated. The lights were still visible. Buildings stood intact. Cars moved through streets. Restaurants and stores operated. People walked around. The prisoners could see evidence that America was at war. But they could also see evidence that the war had not physically destroyed American society. Research on German POW experiences records their amazement at illuminated American cities, comfortable Pullman trains, automobiles, and the quality and quantity of food they encountered on the journey inland. For men who had come from bomb-damaged Europe, this could be profoundly unsettling. And then there was the food. This may sound like a small detail. It wasn't. Food was one of the most powerful demonstrations of American resources. German soldiers had experienced shortages. By the later years of the war, Germany was increasingly struggling with food and fuel. The prisoners therefore noticed immediately when meals in American camps were hot and plentiful. American authorities were required under international law to provide POWs with adequate food and living conditions. But the reality went beyond mere survival. Many camps provided food that reflected German tastes. Prisoners could sometimes purchase additional items such as candy and soda through camp canteens using their prison wages. To a German soldier who had been fighting for months, this could feel almost surreal. Imagine the psychological contradiction. You have just been captured by the enemy. You expect humiliation. You expect hunger. You expect punishment. Instead, someone gives you a bed, a shower, clean clothing, regular meals, medical treatment, and a camp that, while still a prison, is far removed from the destruction you left behind. That did not mean American POW life was luxurious. It wasn't. There were guards, barbed wire, restrictions, discipline, isolation from home, and the constant uncertainty about what would happen next. But compared with the battlefield, it could feel astonishingly safe. The American government had a practical reason for this treatment. The United States was operating under the Geneva Convention, and American officials understood that the treatment of German POWs could directly affect American prisoners held by Germany. If Germany mistreated American prisoners, American officials could point to the treatment of German prisoners in the United States. There was also a strategic dimension. A prisoner who was well fed and treated according to international standards was less likely to become a violent problem inside the camp. But there was another effect. The prisoners were being exposed to America, not through speeches, not necessarily through propaganda, through ordinary life. And ordinary life was becoming a kind of evidence. The camps themselves were scattered across the country. Texas, Arizona, Arkansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, New York, Michigan, Florida, and many other states. The majority were deliberately located away from major cities and sensitive industrial centers. But the prisoners still encountered American society through work programs, transportation, local communities, and the people they met. By the end of the war, the United States had operated hundreds of POW camps and branch facilities. And that created something almost unprecedented. Hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers were being given an accidental tour of the American home front. For some German prisoners, the first truly shocking sight wasn't a factory. It was the farm. American agriculture operated on a scale that could be difficult for Europeans to understand. Large fields, mechanized equipment, tractors, harvesting machinery, storage facilities, road networks connecting farms to towns, and enormous quantities of food. The prisoners often came from a Europe where agriculture was under enormous pressure. Men had been drafted. Horses and vehicles had been requisitioned. Fuel was scarce. Bombing disrupted transportation. Farms were producing under increasingly difficult conditions. Then a German prisoner arrived in America and found himself standing in the middle of an agricultural economy that seemed almost absurdly productive. Some prisoners were eventually put to work. International law permitted enlisted POWs to perform certain forms of labor, though officers generally were exempt. Because American workers were serving in the armed forces, the United States faced serious labor shortages. Farmers needed people to harvest crops. Factories and other civilian industries needed workers. Railroads needed maintenance. So prisoners were assigned to branch camps and labor details. They picked crops, cut timber, worked on roads, performed agricultural tasks, and in some places contributed to other non-military forms of labor. This produced another strange experience. The German prisoner was no longer merely observing America. He was participating in it. A farmer might hand a German prisoner a tool. A local family might watch the prisoners working in a field. Children might encounter them. Workers might speak to them. Sometimes relationships became surprisingly human. The enemy soldier became a person. A prisoner might discover that the American farmer was not the caricature described by Nazi propaganda. He was simply a farmer. He worried about his crops, his family, his sons overseas, the weather, the price of goods, the harvest. The German prisoner might have expected to encounter an enemy. Instead, he encountered ordinary Americans. That could create an uncomfortable question. If these people were supposedly weak, why were they producing so much? The answer was beginning to emerge. America had something Germany desperately lacked: depth, industrial depth, agricultural depth, geographical depth, human resources, raw materials, transportation infrastructure, and the ability to convert all of those resources into military power. The German soldier didn't necessarily understand the full scale immediately, but he could see pieces of it. A train, a factory, a farm, a truck, a warehouse, a city, an automobile, another train, another factory, another field. The individual pieces didn't seem extraordinary. Together, they were enormous. This was the real psychological impact. The German prisoners had been trained to think about war in terms of soldiers and weapons. America was forcing them to see war differently. War could be won by factories, by railroads, by farms, by machine tools, by fuel, by trucks, by electricity, by workers, by thousands of ordinary people performing ordinary jobs. A soldier might destroy one American tank, but somewhere thousands of miles away, another factory was producing another. A German submarine might sink an American ship, but another ship would leave a shipyard. A bomber might destroy a convoy, but another convoy would come. The system seemed endless. And then there was the most frightening part. The Americans were doing all of this while simultaneously fighting a global war. They were sending armies to Europe, armies to the Pacific, aircraft across oceans, ships across the Atlantic, supplies to Britain, equipment to the Soviet Union. And still, American civilians were going to work. Factories were operating. Farms were harvesting. Railroads were moving. The country had not been physically devastated. The industrial machine remained intact. For German prisoners, that realization could be deeply unsettling, because it suggested something their commanders could no longer hide. Germany wasn't simply fighting American soldiers. Germany was fighting the productive capacity of an entire continent-sized nation. By the time many prisoners reached their camps, they had already seen enough to begin questioning what they had believed about America. But the biggest shock was still ahead, because the prisoners were about to discover that the United States had not merely built a huge industrial economy. It had transformed that economy into a weapon, and they were going to see the results firsthand. Not on a battlefield, not from inside a bomber, but from the ground, inside a country that seemed to possess an almost endless supply of everything Germany desperately needed: steel, gasoline, food, trucks, machines, and above all, time. America could continue producing. Germany was running out of everything. And the German prisoners were about to witness exactly what that difference meant. By 1944, the German prisoners in America were beginning to understand something their commanders had spent years trying to deny. The war was not simply being decided by the men fighting at the front. It was being decided thousands of miles behind the front, inside factories, on farms, along railroads, at shipyards, inside machine shops, and in the enormous American supply system that seemed capable of replacing almost everything the war consumed. The prisoners had arrived expecting to see a country weakened by war. Instead, they discovered a country that appeared to be getting stronger. One of the most striking differences was transportation. American railroads were carrying enormous quantities of material across the country. Trains moved through the countryside with astonishing regularity. Cars filled American roads. Trucks moved agricultural products and industrial materials. The prisoners noticed the sheer number of vehicles. That mattered because transportation is the bloodstream of industrial warfare. A factory can produce a tank, but without railroads and trucks, the tank stays at the factory. A farm can produce food, but without transportation, soldiers don't eat it. A refinery can produce fuel, but without pipelines, rail cars, tankers, and trucks, that fuel never reaches the battlefield. America had built an enormous transportation network, and the German prisoners could see it. Then there were the factories. The United States had become the arsenal of democracy long before many of these prisoners ever reached American soil. But propaganda was one thing. Reality was another. The prisoners could see factories operating. They could see workers. They could see machines. They could see warehouses filled with material. And they could see the consequences. American weapons were everywhere. Even a prisoner who never entered an aircraft factory could see American aircraft flying overhead. He could see trucks transporting supplies. He could see military vehicles. He could see ships. The industrial war was surrounding him. The scale was difficult to comprehend. American factories were producing aircraft in numbers Germany struggled to match. Ships were being built at extraordinary speed. Trucks were being manufactured by the hundreds of thousands. Artillery, tanks, ammunition, radios, engines, uniforms, food. Everything was being produced on a scale that reflected the size of the American economy. And the German prisoner had a unique perspective. He wasn't an American celebrating production. He was an enemy soldier who had been trained to believe America was decadent. Now he was watching the supposed decadent society manufacture the tools of war faster than Germany could destroy them. The psychological effect was not necessarily immediate. Some prisoners remained committed Nazis. Some refused to accept what they were seeing. Inside the camps, ideological divisions could become intense. Hardcore Nazi prisoners sometimes intimidated or attacked fellow prisoners they considered disloyal. The United States eventually created measures to separate particularly dangerous ideological factions. So it would be wrong to tell the story as though every German prisoner suddenly abandoned Nazism after seeing an American supermarket or factory. History was more complicated. But for many prisoners, the evidence accumulated. Day after day, month after month. And one of the strongest forms of evidence was simple human comfort. The United States was not starving. The United States was not covered in ruins. The United States could afford to feed hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners. That fact alone was remarkable. American POW policy required adequate food, shelter, clothing, medical care, and other provisions consistent with international obligations. The result was that many German prisoners found their material conditions surprisingly good. Hot meals, beds, showers, medical treatment, recreation, canteens. Some camps even offered educational and cultural activities. For prisoners who had spent years hearing that America was collapsing under the weight of the war, this was difficult to reconcile. Then there was the American worker. This may have been the most powerful lesson of all. A German prisoner might work alongside an American civilian. The American could be an older man, a farmer, a mechanic, a factory worker, someone who had never seen combat. Yet that civilian was helping maintain the American war machine. The German prisoner could look at him and realize something. The American military wasn't being supported by a tiny elite. It was being supported by millions of civilians. Farmers grew food. Women worked in factories. Railroad workers moved supplies. Mechanics maintained vehicles. Clerks organized shipments. Engineers designed machines. The entire society had been mobilized, and the German prisoner was seeing only a tiny fraction of it. That was the frightening part. If one American town could look this productive, what did the rest of the country look like? If one farm could produce this much food, what were thousands of farms producing? If one factory could build so many machines, what were Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Los Angeles, and the other industrial centers producing? The prisoner couldn't see the whole picture, but the pieces were enough. America's industrial strength wasn't concentrated in one location. It was distributed across an enormous nation. That made it extraordinarily difficult to destroy. Germany had industrial power too. German engineers were among the finest in the world. German factories produced excellent weapons. But Germany faced increasingly severe constraints. Bombing damaged factories. Fuel shortages crippled transportation. Raw materials became harder to obtain. Labor shortages grew. The Nazi regime increasingly relied on forced labor from occupied territories and concentration camps. The contrast with the American home front was stark. Germany was squeezing more production from a system under extreme pressure. America was expanding production from a secure industrial base. The prisoners were therefore witnessing something more important than abundance. They were witnessing sustainability. America could keep doing this. That was the terrifying conclusion. The United States did not need one extraordinary year of production. It could continue. Another month. Another year. Another shipment. Another convoy. Another aircraft. Another tank. Another truck. And the longer the war lasted, the stronger the American material advantage became. Germany needed the opposite. Germany needed the war to end quickly. This helps explain one of the great paradoxes of the Second World War. Germany possessed some extraordinary weapons. The Tiger, the Panther, the Me-262, advanced submarines, powerful artillery, highly trained military formations. But individual excellence could not overcome a collapsing strategic foundation. A Tiger tank was useless without fuel. A fighter was useless without aviation gasoline. An army was useless without ammunition. And soldiers were useless without food. America's industrial system was designed to keep supplying all of them. The German prisoners also encountered something that Nazi ideology had struggled to explain. American abundance existed alongside ordinary life. People went to work. Children attended school. Families went shopping. Farmers harvested crops. Baseball games continued. people went to the movies. There were rationing restrictions, of course. Gasoline and some foods were rationed. The country was not living in complete luxury. But compared with wartime Europe, the contrast was enormous. The United States was fighting a global war without having its industrial heartland destroyed. That was an extraordinary strategic advantage. Some German prisoners later remembered America with surprising warmth. Some returned after the war. Some eventually became American citizens. Others returned to Germany and rebuilt their lives. Their experiences were not identical. Some hated America. Some remained loyal to Nazi ideas. Some simply wanted to forget the war. But many had discovered that the American people did not resemble the caricatures they had been taught to believe. The enemy had faces, names, families, jobs, and ordinary concerns. That human contact could undermine ideology more effectively than a political speech. The American POW system, therefore, produced an unintended experiment. Germany had sent these men into battle with one image of America. The United States imprisoned them, and then exposed them to another. The prisoners saw American farms, American factories, American trains, American towns, American food, American workers, and American military equipment. They saw a society capable of feeding its own people while simultaneously feeding hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners. They saw an economy capable of producing enormous quantities of weapons while maintaining civilian life. And slowly, some began to understand. The United States was not winning simply because its soldiers were brave. America was winning because it could sustain war on an enormous scale. Then came the final months. Germany collapsed. The European War ended in May 1945. But the prisoners remained in America for months afterward. Some did agricultural work. Some worked in other permitted civilian industries. The United States still needed labor, and the prisoners were still part of the massive logistical system that had brought them there. The irony was extraordinary. German soldiers had entered America as enemies. Now some were helping harvest American crops. The war they had expected to win had transformed them into temporary workers inside the country they had been told was decadent and weak. When many of these men finally returned home, they carried something with them that could not be confiscated. Memory. They had seen America. Not through Nazi newspapers. Not through speeches. Not through battlefield rumors. They had seen it with their own eyes. The factories. The farms. The roads. The trains. The food. The ordinary people. And the sheer depth of American production. The United States had not defeated Germany with industry alone. Millions of soldiers fought. Thousands of airmen died. Sailors crossed dangerous oceans. Marines and soldiers stormed beaches. Allied forces fought and died across Europe. But behind those men stood an industrial system capable of replacing what war destroyed. That system was the Invisible Army. And perhaps that is why the story of the German POWs in America remains so fascinating. They entered the United States as prisoners. But in a strange way, they became witnesses. Witnesses to the largest industrial mobilization the world had ever seen. They saw why American factories could replace losses. Why Allied armies could keep advancing. Why American aircraft kept appearing over Europe. Why trucks kept bringing ammunition forward. Why soldiers were fed. Why tanks kept moving. And eventually, why Germany could not win a long war against the United States. The battlefield had shown them American firepower. America itself showed them where that firepower came from. It came from millions of ordinary people, working in millions of ordinary places, producing an extraordinary amount of everything. And that was the realization the German POWs could not escape. They had not been captured by an army that was merely stronger than theirs. They had been captured by a nation whose industrial capacity was so vast that even its prisoners could see only a small piece of it. And perhaps the most remarkable part of the story is what happened after the barbed wire disappeared. Many of those prisoners went home. Some never forgot what they had seen. And for some, the memory of America would become part of the story of how they understood the war they had lost.